10:05 in the morning. The Barents Sea. A Russian Zircon hypersonic cruise missile was already screaming through the upper atmosphere at Mach 7. It was supposed to be a controlled test within a restricted military corridor. Instead, the guidance computer had just suffered a catastrophic logic failure. The question was no longer where the missile was intended to go. It was how many thousands of people would die when it arrived at its new destination. The Zircon is a weapon defined by the brutal laws of physics. It travels at 9 times the speed of sound. At that velocity, the air around the missile becomes so hot that it turns into a glowing shroud of ionized gas. This is called a plasma sheath. It acts as a physical barrier. It blocks all incoming radio signals. This makes the missile nearly impossible for ground-based radar to track with precision. It also makes the missile deaf to its own creators. On the bridge of the Russian frigate, Admiral Gorshkov, the atmosphere turned from professional pride to cold terror in seconds. The weapons officer stared at his glass display. The telemetry link is gone. The weapon has ignored the mid-course correction. The captain stepped toward the console. His voice was tight.
It's offline.
Is the self-destruct active? The officer shook his head. Negative. The plasma shield is preventing the command from reaching the receiver. We have lost the link. Specify the current bearing. Bearing is 095. It is heading east, high altitude. It is accelerating to Mach 9, 4,000 miles away. In the high desert of Colorado, a constellation of satellites detected a massive thermal bloom. The space-based infrared system, known as ESPERS, identified the heat signature instantly. It was not the massive plume of an intercontinental ballistic missile. It was smaller, sharper. It was moving horizontally across the edge of space. Inside the bunker at Buckley Space Force Base, an analyst watched the red tracks stabilize on his screen. I have a high-speed thermal contact. Origin is the Barents Sea. His supervisor moved to the station. Check the profile. Is it a ballistic launch? Negative. It is a cruise missile profile. Altitude is 30,000 meters. Speed is Mach 8.2. The supervisor gripped the back of the chair. That is a hypersonic. Is it staying in the test range? The analyst watched the numbers update. Negative. It has crossed the range boundary. It is over international water. It is heading straight for the Pacific. The Zircon was now moving at nearly 2 miles every second. At this speed, geography is no longer a barrier. It becomes a countdown. The Russian technicians on the Admiral Gorshkov tried every override code in their manual. Every signal hit the plasma shield and vanished into the white noise of the atmosphere. The missile was blind. The Americans were not. The trajectory was a straight line of mathematical certainty. It crossed the Russian coastline. It entered the airspace over the Sea of Okhotsk. If the missile maintained this heading, it would reach the Japanese home islands in less than 5 minutes. Specifically, it was on a direct bearing for Misawa Air Base. Misawa is a critical hub for American air power in the Pacific. It houses thousands of service members and their families. Inside the Russian command center, the realization was absolute. They had lost control of a strategic weapon. They had no way to tell the Americans that the missile was unarmed, and they had no way to stop it before it hit. The morning was still quiet. It would not stay that way. 10:09 in the morning. The 613th Air Operations Center in Hawaii. The blue Pacific flashed across the massive digital wall of the command center. Usually, the screens showed the steady flow of commercial air traffic. Tankers, cargo planes, routine patrols. Today, a single red vector began to extend from the north. It moved with a speed that defied traditional physics. The watch officer stared at the data feed from the space-based infrared system. We have a confirmed thermal track. It is a Zircon. Speed is Mach 9.2. A general stood at the center of the room. His name was Miller. He did not look at the map. He looked at the timer. Destination. The analyst adjusted his headset. It is on a ballistic descent profile, but it is not a ballistic missile. It is maneuvering. The current bearing puts it over the Sea of Japan in 3 minutes. General Miller spoke clearly. Which base? The analyst hesitated. It is a direct line to Misawa. Impact in 7 minutes. The room went silent. Misawa Air Base was home to 2 squadrons of F-16 fighters. It was a primary node for regional surveillance. It was also a city. Thousands of dependents lived in the housing units near the runway. At Mach 9, there is no time for a conventional evacuation. There is only time to pray. General Miller turned to his communications officer. Get the National Military Command Center on the line. I want the Russian defense attaché. Now. The officer worked the console. Sir, the Russians are broadcasting on all frequencies. They are not encrypted. What are they saying? They are issuing a navigational warning. They are calling it astray. They are telling us the weapon is inert. General Miller looked back at the screen. The red line was now over the Kuril Islands. They expect us to believe that. A hypersonic missile is heading for a major base, and they say it is a mistake. 400 miles north of Japan, the USS Higgins was on a routine station. The Higgins is an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer. It is equipped with the Aegis combat system. This is the most advanced naval defense system in the world. But it was never designed to hit something moving at 7,000 miles per hour. Inside the Combat Information Center, the lights were low. The air was cool. The tactical action officer watched the radar sweep. Contact. Designated Sierra 114. Range is 300 miles. Altitude is 80,000 feet. The captain of the Higgins entered the room. Is that the Russian test? The officer did not look up. If it is, the test just failed. It is coming straight at us. It will pass our position in 90 seconds. The captain gripped the rail. Status of the SM-3 missiles. The standard missile, 3 is ready. But the tracking solution is unstable. The target is too fast for a kinetic kill. We are looking at a probability of intercept of less than 10%. The captain looked at the clock. It was 10:10 in the morning. Clear the engagement zone. Notify the Japanese Self-Defense Force. Tell them a high-speed contact is entering their sovereign airspace. In the Russian Northern Fleet Command. The panic was different. It was the panic of a man who had dropped a loaded gun in a crowded room. Admiral Volkov watched the same red line on his own screen. He knew what the Americans were seeing. He knew their protocols. If a Russian missile approached an American base, the Americans would respond, not just against the missile, but against the source. Volkov spoke to his adjutant. The hotline is still dead. Why is the hotline dead? The fiber optic link in the Baltic is undergoing maintenance. We are trying to reroute through the satellite link in Moscow. We do not have minutes, we have seconds. If that missile hits Misawa, even without a warhead, the kinetic energy will level the base. They will think it is a nuclear strike. The Zircon was now crossing the 100-mile mark from the Japanese coast. It was so fast that the friction was peeling the paint from its nose cone. The guidance computer was dead. The missile was a 3-ton slug of metal and fuel. It was a meteor with a Russian flag on the side. 10:11 in the morning. The first sirens began to wail in northern Japan. The residents of Misawa looked at the clear blue sky. They saw nothing, but the computers saw everything. 10:12 in the morning. Misawa Air Base, northern Japan. The base sirens were no longer a drill. They were a steady, piercing scream. On the tarmac, 2 F-16 fighters were already rolling. Their afterburners carved white lines into the morning sky. But the pilots knew the truth. They were flying toward a ghost, a target they could not see and could not catch. Inside the underground command post, Colonel Sarah Bennett watched the primary radar screen. The refresh rate was too slow. Every time the beam swept around, the red dot had jumped 50 miles. Colonel Bennett turned to her operations officer. "Tell me we have a solution." The officer wiped sweat from his upper lip. "Ma'am, it is too fast. By the time the Patriot batteries on the perimeter can lock on, the missile will have already impacted. We are looking at a 30-second window from detection to impact." What about the Higgins? The Higgins is attempting a remote engage. They are slaving their radar to the satellite feed, but the plasma sheath is scattering the signal. It is like trying to hit a bullet with another bullet. In the dark. 10:13 in the morning. The math of the situation was becoming a death sentence. At Mach 9, The Zircon was covering 100 miles every minute. It had just crossed the central line of the Sea of Japan. It was now 300 miles from the coast of Honshu. 3 minutes of flight time remained. The kinetic energy of a 3-ton object moving at 9 times the speed of sound is equivalent to several tons of high explosives. Even without a nuclear warhead, a direct hit on the fuel depots at Misawa would trigger a firestorm. The base would be vaporized. The surrounding city of Misawa would be shattered by the overpressure wave. Colonel Bennett picked up the secure line to Hawaii. This is Misawa Actual. We are beginning a base-wide bunker transition. We cannot stop this. I repeat, we cannot stop this. In Hawaii? General Miller heard the finality in her voice. He looked at his own board. Is there any change in the trajectory? The analyst replied, negative. It is a straight line. Bearing remains 095. If it does not deviate, it hits the center of the runway in 180 seconds. General Miller turned to his legal advisor. If that weapon hits, it is an act of war, whether it was a mistake or not. Does the president have the brief? The president is in the situation room. They are tracking. The question is the response. If we lose Misawa, we have to assume a wider strike is coming. This was the trap of hypersonic warfare. The speed removes the time required for diplomacy. It forces a hair-trigger response. If you wait to see if the missile is a mistake, you are dead. If you fire back, you might start a war that cannot be stopped. The red dot on the screen was now 200 miles away. The Japanese Prime Minister was being moved to a hardened facility. The world was shrinking. The air over the Sea of Japan was cold and clear. High above, the Zircon continued its blind, relentless dive. 10:14 in the morning. The Sea of Japan. The USS Higgins was no longer just a spectator. It was the only barrier left between a rogue hypersonic missile and the Japanese coastline. Inside the Combat Information Center, the blue glow of the consoles reflected off the faces of the crew. They were trained for this. The tactical action officer spoke. Captain, we have a solid track via the satellite relay. The target is inside the engagement envelope for a remote launch. Time to intercept is 90 seconds. The captain of the Higgins stood behind the console. He was a man named Evans. He knew that firing a missile at a Russian asset was a line that had not been crossed in decades, even if the asset was a runaway test vehicle. Captain Evans leaned forward. What are our rules of engagement? The tactical action officer checked his screen. 7th Fleet Command has authorized defensive fire. Under the current status, we are clear to engage any inbound threat to a treaty ally. Japan has requested immediate assistance. The problem is the speed, the officer continued. To hit a target at Mach 9, we have to fire now. If we wait for a positive identification on our own organic radar, we will miss the window. We have to trust the satellite data. Captain Evans looked at the digital map. The red vector was slicing toward the coast. Weapons. Prepare to launch 2 Standard Missile 3 interceptors. Salvo fire. Ripple timing. 4 seconds apart. Aye, sir. Standard Missile 3. Selecting cells 2-4 and 2-6. Launchers are energized, while the Americans prepared to fire. The Russian command was in a state of frantic improvisation. Admiral Volkov was now on a direct radio link with the Pacific Fleet headquarters in Vladivostok. We cannot wait for the satellite link, Volkov shouted. The Americans will think we are attacking. Use the International Maritime Distress Frequency. Broadcast on all channels in the clear. Tell them the missile has no warhead. Tell them it is an inert block of steel. The communications officer was typing rapidly. Sir, I am broadcasting, but the Higgins is 300 miles away. We do not know if they are monitoring the distress frequency while in a combat state. Volkov looked at the clock. 10, 14, and 30 seconds. They will see the launch of their own interceptors on their radar. Once they fire, the cycle cannot be stopped. They will assume we have initiated an exchange. Back on the Higgins. The order was given. Captain Evans spoke with a steady voice. Authorize weapons release. Take the shot. Weapons release authorized. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Deep within the hull of the destroyer, the armored lids of the vertical launch system flipped open. Two massive rockets ignited with a roar that vibrated through the steel of the ship. The Standard Missile 3 interceptors shot into the air. They were carried by a pillar of white flame and gray smoke. Within seconds, they were supersonic. Within a minute, they would be at the edge of space. The first aggressive move of the crisis had been made. The Americans had fired. On the bridge of the Higgins, the crew watched the two green dots on the screen climb toward the red line. It was a race of two different technologies. One was a blind hammer. The other was a precision scalpel. The tactical action officer called out the updates. Boosters have separated. The kinetic warheads are searching. We have a telemetry lock. Then, the display flickered. Captain, something is wrong. The target is not where it should be. It is not following a ballistic curve. It is skipping. The Zircon was not just a missile. It was a wave rider. As it hit the denser layers of the atmosphere, it began to bounce. Like a flat stone on a pond. The Standard Missile 3 was designed to hit targets on a predictable path. It was not designed for a target that could change its altitude by 10,000 feet in a heartbeat. The two interceptors began to adjust their thrusters. They were fighting the laws of physics to stay on course. The morning air was no longer empty. It was filled with the heat of the chase. 10:15 in the morning. Northern Fleet Command in Severomorsk. The Russian military headquarters was a hive of controlled desperation. Admiral Volkov stood before a bank of encrypted communication terminals. He was staring at a red telephone that remained stubbornly silent. This was the Washington-Moscow Direct Communications link. The hotline. It was designed specifically for moments exactly like this, to prevent a technical error from becoming a global catastrophe. Admiral Volkov turned to his chief of staff. Why is the line still dark? I ordered the activation 3 minutes ago. The officer looked pale. Sir, the primary fiber optic gateway in the Baltic is down for scheduled maintenance. The automated reroute through the satellite link in Moscow is hanging. There is a synchronization error in the encryption keys. Volkov slammed his hand onto the metal desk. We are 60 seconds away from a kinetic impact on a United States sovereign base. Override the encryption. Send the message in the clear. Use the emergency burst transmitter. Sir, if we send it in the clear, every intelligence agency in the world will see our failure. The Kremlin has not authorized a breach of security protocol. Volkov grabbed the officer by his collar. His voice was a low growl. If that missile hits Misawa, there will be no Kremlin left to authorize anything. Send the message. Tell them the Zircon is a dummy. Tell them the warhead is solid concrete. Now, across the world, inside the National Military Command Center at the Pentagon, the tension was suffocating. The Joint Chiefs of Staff were gathered around a secure conferencing table. A live feed from Hawaii occupied the center screen. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs spoke into his headset. Hawaii, this is Washington. Status of the intercept. General Miller responded from his command center. The USS Higgins has 2 missiles in the air, but the target is performing high-G maneuvers at the edge of the atmosphere. The SM-3 interceptors are struggling to maintain a lead. We are looking at a probable miss. The chairman looked at the clock. What is the status of the Russian hotline? Still silent. We have attempted to initiate contact 4 times. No response. The Russians are silent. That is not true. An intelligence officer interrupted. Sir, we are picking up an unencrypted burst transmission on an old emergency frequency. It is originating from Northern Fleet Command. It is in Russian and English. The chairman leaned forward. Read it. The officer adjusted his headset. It says, deviation accidental. Weapon is inert. Repeat. Weapon is inert. Do not engage. We are attempting self-destruct. The Secretary of Defense looked at the chairman. Do we believe them? It could be a ruse to prevent us from launching a counterstrike. The chairman shook his head. They would not use a Zircon for a first strike on a single base. They would use a full salvo. This smells like a logic failure. But the problem is not the intent. The problem is the impact. 3 tons of steel at Mach 9 is still a weapon of mass destruction. General Miller, the chairman continued, if the intercept fails, what is our status for a retaliatory launch? General Miller's voice was cold. We have 2 Ohio-class submarines in the Sea of Japan. They are at launch depth. Their missiles are targeted at the Russian Pacific Fleet hubs. If Misawa is leveled, we are ready to respond within 5 minutes of impact. The Zircon was now crossing the final 100 miles. It was no longer a dot on a screen. It was a physical presence, a streak of fire across the sky over the Sea of Japan. The plasma sheath was glowing brighter as the air grew thicker. The missile was accelerating as it entered its terminal dive on the USS Higgins. The tactical action officer watched the 2 green dots of the interceptors pass through the path of the red line. Intercept in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The screen flashed, then settled. The officer's voice dropped. Clean miss. The interceptors missed the target. The Zircon has entered the inner defense zone. It is 90 seconds from the Japanese coast. The Americans had committed their defense. The Russians had committed their explanation. Both had failed. The crisis was no longer about communication or planning. It was about what would happen when the kinetic energy of a hypersonic flight met the solid ground of Japan. The sky over Misawa was clear, but the air felt heavy with the weight of what was coming. 10, 15, and 30 seconds in the morning. Misawa Air Base, northern Japan. The air above the base was no longer empty. It was vibrating. The sound was a low and rhythmic pulse. It was the sound of the atmosphere being torn apart by an object moving at 6,000 miles per hour. On the north end of the runway, the Patriot advanced capability. 3 batteries were fully vertical. These are known as PAC-3 interceptors. They are the final line of defense for a high-value target. They do not use explosives to destroy a target. They use kinetic energy. They are essentially guided telephone poles of solid metal. They hit the target with such force that both objects are pulverized instantly. Inside the Patriot engagement control station, the operator gripped the firing handles. His screen was a chaotic swirl of electronic noise. The Zircon was now so low that the ground clutter was interfering with the radar return. The operator shouted over the noise of the cooling fans. I have a momentary lock. Range is 40 miles. Altitude is 15,000 meters. The fire control officer did not hesitate. Engage. Salvo fire. All remaining missiles. 2 Patriot missiles erupted from their canisters. They did not climb into the sky like the SM-3 from the ship. They shot forward, staying low. They were accelerating toward Mach 4 in seconds, 10:16 in the morning. The Zircon crossed the Japanese shoreline. At this altitude, the plasma sheath had thinned. The missile was a glowing white spear of heat. People on the ground near the coast looked up. For a fraction of a second, they did not see a missile. They saw a flash of light followed by a sonic boom that shattered windows for 3 miles in every direction. In the Air Operations Center in Hawaii, General Miller watched the live telemetry from a Japanese ground station. The red dot and the 2 blue dots of the Patriot missiles were converging. Time to impact. The analyst counted down. 10 seconds. 9, 8, 7. Inside the Misawa command post, Colonel Bennett felt the floor shaking. The sound was now a continuous roar, like a freight train passing through the room. The analyst in Hawaii continued. 6, 5, 4. On the radar screen, the dots merged. The display turned white as the computer processors struggled to resolve the collision. For 3 seconds, no one breathed. The silence in the command centers across the world was absolute. 10:16 in the morning. The sky over northern Japan. The 2 Patriot missiles detonated within 50 meters of the Zircon. A cloud of tungsten pellets and high explosives expanded into the path of the hypersonic spear. It was not a direct hit at Mach 9. A direct hit is almost impossible. It was a proximity kill. The shockwave slammed into the Zircon. The ceramic heat shield on its left side shattered. The control fins, glowing orange from the friction of the descent, were sheared away. Inside the Misawa command post, the floor stopped shaking. Colonel Bennett looked at the screen. Status. Is it down? The operator was frantic. The signature has fragmented, but the main mass is still moving. It is not falling. It is tumbling. In Hawaii, General Miller saw the red line break into 3 smaller vectors. The computer was trying to calculate new impact points. It is overshooting, the analyst shouted. The interceptor changed its vector by 2 degrees. It is no longer heading for the runway. The Zircon was now a dying star. It was no longer a guided weapon. It was 3 tons of white-hot metal tumbling through the sky at 5 times the speed of sound. It passed directly over the Misawa housing area at an altitude of only 5,000 feet. The sonic boom was so powerful it flattened fences and stripped the leaves from trees. Then, the pivot happened. In the Russian Northern Fleet Command, Admiral Volkov received a data burst from a secret backup channel. The missile's internal flight recorder had rebooted for 1 final second before the heat destroyed the sensors. Sir, the Russian officer called out, the weapon has initiated an emergency fuel purge. It is venting its remaining propellant. Volkov leaned in. Why? The impact with the American interceptor triggered a failsafe. The missile thinks it has reached its target. It is attempting to minimize the secondary explosion. This was the moment of grace. The Zircon was no longer accelerating. It was a heavy, aerodynamic brick. On the USS Higgins, Captain Evans watched the new trajectory. Where is it going? It has cleared the base perimeter, the officer replied. It is heading for the Pacific. Current projected impact point is 12 miles offshore. The missile had passed over the lives of 10,000 people in a heartbeat. It had come within 600 meters of the base tower, but the math of the collision had saved the city. The Zircon hit the water 12 miles east of the Japanese coast. The impact was so violent that it created a column of steam and salt water that rose 400 feet into the air. Then, silence. The radar screens at Misawa were clear. The sirens in the town continued to wail, but the sky was empty. General Miller sat back in his chair in Hawaii. He looked at the timer. It had been 6 minutes since the first detection. Status of the retaliatory strike, Miller asked. The communications officer looked at his board. The submarines are still at launch depth. The president is holding the order. They are waiting for our assessment. Miller wiped his face with his hand. Tell them it was a miss, a lucky miss. Stand down to Defense Condition 3. But keep the sensors locked on the Northern Fleet. I want to know if they so much as sneeze. The crisis was not over, but the clock had stopped. 10:17 in the morning, 12 miles off the coast of Misawa. The geyser of white water was visible on the infrared cameras of the USS Higgins. It was a jagged spike of heat against the cold blue of the Pacific. Then, it collapsed. The radar screen was empty. The sound of the impact reached the ship seconds later. A dull, distant thud that traveled through the hull. Inside the Combat Information Center, the tactical action officer did not celebrate. He kept his eyes on the scan. Splash confirmed. Target Sierra 114 is down. No secondary explosions detected. No radiation spikes on the atmospheric sensors. Captain Evans wiped the palm of his hand against his uniform. Maintain station. Keep the SM-2 missiles on the rail. I want a full sweep for any following contacts. If this was a lead element, we need to know now. Radar is clear for 50 miles, the officer replied. The air is empty. At the same moment, 4,000 miles away in the Russian Northern Fleet Command, the red light on the hotline terminal finally turned solid green. The synchronization error had been bypassed. The link was live. Admiral Volkov grabbed the receiver before the first ring finished. This is Northern Fleet Command. Admiral Volkov speaking. The voice on the other end was calm, controlled. It belonged to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington. Admiral, this is General Reed. We have just confirmed the splashdown of your Zircon missile 12 miles off Misawa. You have exactly 30 seconds To explain why we should not initiate a proportional response against your Pacific assets, Volkov did not blink. He looked at the data on his screen. General, the weapon suffered a total guidance failure during a closed-loop test. The telemetry link was severed by the plasma sheath. We attempted a self-destruct command. It failed to penetrate the shield. The missile was inert. It carried no warhead. It was a weighted test vehicle. You violated Japanese sovereign airspace with a strategic weapon, General Reed said. You came within 600 meters of a United States Air Force installation. We are aware, Volkov replied. The error was technical, not intentional. We are currently broadcasting an open apology on all maritime frequencies. We have ordered all Pacific Fleet units to return to port. We are standing down our readiness. We ask that you do the same. There was a long pause on the line, 10 seconds of static that felt like an hour. We are tracking your movements, Admiral, Reed said. If one ship moves toward the Japanese coast, the Higgins has orders to fire. Do you understand? I understand, Volkov said. The Gorshkov is turning north now. We are clear of the test zone. The line went dead. Volkov leaned back in his chair. He was trembling, not from fear, but from the release of adrenaline. He looked at the map. The red line had stopped. 10:18 in the morning, Misawa Air Base. The sirens finally fell silent. The base remained in a state of lockdown, but the immediate threat had passed. On the streets of the city, people emerged from shops and homes. They looked at the shattered windows and the fallen fences. They looked at the sky. They didn't know how close they had come to the end of the world. Colonel Bennett stood on the balcony of the command tower. She looked out toward the Pacific. The horizon was clear, but in her mind, she could still see the glowing spear of the Zircon. Her operations officer stepped out behind her. Ma'am, 5th Air Force is asking for a damage assessment. They want to know if the runway is operational. Bennett didn't turn around. The runway is fine, but the glass in the tower is gone. Tell them, we are operational, but we are shaken. And the Russians? The Russians are running for home, Bennett said. They know they got away with one. They won't be back today. The crisis was resolving. The machines had failed. The humans had held the line. But the window of time for decision-making had just been permanently shortened. The world had learned that at Mach 9. There is no time for a second chance. 10:22 in the morning, 12 miles off the coast of Misawa. The surface of the Pacific Ocean was regaining its composure. The massive plume of steam had dissipated into a low-hanging mist. But beneath the waves, the story of the Zircon was still being written. 3 tons of exotic alloys and fried electronics were sinking toward the sea floor. 2,000 meters of cold, pressurized water. A Pate Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft was already on station. Its call sign was Combat 6. It had been diverted from a routine subsurface surveillance mission 50 miles away. Inside the cramped cabin of the Pate, the sensor operators were working with a sense of quiet intensity. They weren't looking for a submarine anymore. They were looking for a ghost. The lead acoustic analyst spoke into his headset. I have the impact signature on the sono buoys. It was a high-velocity entry. The wreckage is concentrated in a 300-meter radius. Depth is approximately 2,100 meters. The pilot of the Pate, a lieutenant commander named Sarah Jenkins, looked out the side window. She could see the dark patch of water where the missile had vanished. Copy that. Mark the coordinates. I want a persistent track on that location. 7th Fleet is sending a recovery vessel from Yokosuka. We cannot let the Russians get to this first. Ma'am, the analyst said. We have company. On the radar screen, a Russian Beriev Bay-200 search and rescue plane was approaching from the north. It had flown out of Vladivostok at maximum speed. Behind it, 2 Su-35 fighters were providing a high-altitude escort. The air was no longer a battleground of missiles. It was becoming a battleground of recovery. In Hawaii, General Miller watched the new icons appear on the map. The tension in the room had shifted from existential dread to tactical competition. The Russians want their trash back, Miller said. They know that if we pull that guidance chip out of the water, we will know every frequency and every logic gate in their hypersonic program. General Miller turned to his aide. What is the status of our surface assets? The USS Higgins is 5 miles from the splash point. She is standing by. The Japanese Coast Guard has 3 cutters inbound. They are claiming this as an environmental hazard within their exclusive economic zone. Miller nodded. Good. Let the Japanese lead the legal argument, but keep the Higgins close. If those Russian fighters dip below 10,000 feet, I want them painted with every fire control radar we have. This is not a test anymore. It is a crime scene. Inside the Russian Su-35 cockpit, the pilot felt the hum of the American radar on his skin. His warning receiver was chirping. A steady, persistent reminder that he was being watched by $1 billion of Aegis technology. He spoke to his wingman. Guardian 2. I am being painted by the destroyer. I am staying in the international corridor. Do not deviate. Copy. I see the pate. They are dropping more buoys. Let them drop, the lead pilot said. His voice was tired. Our orders are to observe, not to engage. The Admiral has made it clear. No more mistakes today. The 2 sides were now hovering over a single point in the vast ocean, like 2 predators over a kill. Neither side wanted to fire, but neither side could afford to leave. 10:25 in the morning. The digital clock on the wall of the Misawa command post continued to tick. The immediate danger of a kinetic strike had passed, but the mystery of why the missile had failed was just beginning to unfold. In the quiet of the bunkers, specialists were already reviewing the high-speed video from the Patriot batteries. They saw the Zircon tumbling. They saw the fuel purge. They saw a weapon that seemed to be fighting itself. Colonel Bennett sat at her desk. She was looking at a photograph of her daughter. Her hands were finally still. It wasn't a strike, she whispered to the empty room. It was a breakdown. But in the world of high-stakes military strategy, a breakdown can be just as lethal as an intentional act. The world had come within 6 minutes of a nuclear exchange because a line of code had failed in a cold laboratory in Russia. 10:30 in the morning. The National Military Command Center. The large digital map of the Sea of Japan was still glowing, but the red vectors had faded. The icons for the American carrier strike groups were no longer flashing in combat mode. The state of high alert was being dismantled, one mouse click at a time. General Reed stood at the head of the table. He did not look like a man who had just won a battle. He looked like a man who had barely escaped a high-speed collision. He adjusted his glasses and looked at the Secretary of Defense. The Russians have confirmed all units are returning to their previous stations, Reed said. The Gorshkov is moving north. The fighters over the splash zone are maintaining a distance of 20 miles from the Higgins. The Secretary of Defense nodded slowly. And the President. The President has authorized a return to Defense Condition 3 for the Pacific Theater, Reed replied. The nuclear command and control link has been transitioned back to standby. We are no longer on a hair trigger. The room was filled with the low hum of computer cooling fans. There was no cheering. There were no handshakes. The atmosphere was heavy with the weight of the last 20 minutes. In the corner, an officer was quietly weeping. The release of tension was physical. General Reed spoke into the secure link to Hawaii. General Miller, this is the chairman. You are authorized to maintain a surveillance curtain around the crash site, but I want no aggressive maneuvers. If the Russians want to look at the bubbles, let them look. We have the data we need from the Patriot sensors. General Miller's voice came through the speakers. It sounded weary. Copy that. Defense Condition 3 is active. The Higgins is standing by. We are monitoring. It is quiet out here. Too quiet. In the Russian Northern Fleet Command, Admiral Volkov was watching his own screens. The red line of the Zircon was gone. It had been replaced by a small, pulsing icon that marked the impact coordinates. Volkov spoke to his chief of staff. The weapon is at the bottom of the sea. But the damage is on the surface. We have shown the Americans that our most advanced system is unstable. We have given them a reason to increase their missile defenses in Japan. The chief of staff did not look up from his console. The report for the Kremlin is being finalized. We are classifying it as a hardware logic error. A faulty sensor in the scramjet intake caused a false target lock. It was a technical failure. Volkov shook his head. It was a failure of imagination. We built a weapon that outruns our ability to control it. We removed the luxury of time from the battlefield. Today, we almost paid for that in blood. We removed the luxury of time from the battlefield. Today, we almost paid for that in blood. 10:35 in the morning. The world was returning to its normal rhythm. Cargo ships in the Sea of Japan resumed their courses. Fishing boats near Misawa headed back to sea. The sky was a deep and empty blue. Inside the Misawa command post, Colonel Bennett watched the last of her staff clear the room. She was alone with the glowing screens. The data from the Patriot intercept was being uploaded to a secure server in Colorado. It would be studied for years. Every microsecond of the flight would be dissected. But the data could not capture the feeling of the floor shaking. It could not capture the sound of the air being torn apart. Colonel Bennett walked to the window. The glass was gone. The cool morning air smelled like salt and jet fuel. She looked at the runway. It was scarred by the tire marks of the F-16s that had scrambled to intercept a ghost. The crisis had resolved. Not through a victory, but through a series of desperate, professional decisions made under the pressure of a ticking clock. Both sides had looked into the abyss. Both sides had blinked. The morning air was finally still. The immediate danger had passed. The analysis was just beginning. 12:30 in the afternoon, 2 hours after the impact. Misawa Air Base. The silence at the base was no longer a state of emergency. It was the heavy quiet of a massive machine cooling down. Maintenance crews moved across the flight line. They were picking up debris, not from the missile, but from the buildings. The supersonic pressure wave had shattered hundreds of windows. It had buckled the doors of 3 hangars. Colonel Bennett stood in the middle of the runway. She looked at the horizon. The sky was still clear, but the air felt different. It felt fragile. A master sergeant approached her. He was carrying a clipboard. "Ma'am, engineering reports, the runway is clear. The F-16s are recovered. We have minor structural damage to the tower. No injuries reported among the personnel or the dependents." Bennett took a deep breath. "What about the town?" "The Japanese police are reporting broken glass and some minor injuries from the sonic boom. But everyone is alive. It is a miracle. 10 more seconds of flight time and we would be digging people out of the rubble." Bennett looked toward the sea. It was not a miracle. It was a failure of a Russian guidance chip. We just happened to be in the way. 300 miles to the north, on the bridge of the Admiral Gorshkov, the atmosphere was one of somber professional retreat. The frigate was moving at 20 knots, heading back toward the Arctic. The captain looked at the empty horizon. The Americans are still over the splash site. Admiral Volkov stood beside him. "They will be there for weeks. They will map every piece of titanium on the sea floor. They will know the chemical composition of our fuel. They will know our secret. They will know that we cannot control what we have built. The Kremlin wants a full report by 1800 hours," the captain said. "The report is simple," Volkov replied. "We pushed the envelope of physics, and the envelope tore. We told the world we had a weapon that could not be stopped. Today, we proved that we also have a weapon that cannot be steered. That is a dangerous message to send to an adversary." 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The Pentagon, Washington, D.C. Inside a windowless briefing room, a group of technical analysts presented their initial findings to the Joint Chiefs. On the screen, a high-speed replay of the Patriot intercept played in a loop. The impact was not a direct hit, the lead analyst explained. The PAC-3 missiles detonated within 40 meters. The pressure wave was enough to destabilize the Zircon scramjet intake. That triggered the flameout. Once the engine died, the missile became a lawn dart. The fuel purge was likely an automated safety routine, not a manual override. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs leaned forward. "So, can we stop them?" The analyst hesitated. 1. Yes. 10. Maybe. 100. No. This was a single errant missile. If the Russians launch a saturation strike, our sensors will be overwhelmed in less than 90 seconds. We got lucky because this was a solitary ghost. The chairman looked at the map of the Pacific. It was dotted with bases, ports, cities. The window is 6 minutes. from the Barents Sea to a target in Japan. 6 minutes. That is not enough time to call the president. It is barely enough time to wake up. The realization was sinking in across the highest levels of government. The era of strategic depth was over. Speed had deleted the buffer zone between a mistake and a war. In the Sea of Japan, the sun began to set. The USS Higgins was a dark silhouette against the orange sky. Its radar continued to sweep the empty air. Below the waves, the Zircon lay in the dark. It was a broken monument to the new reality of warfare. The day was ending, but the shadow of those 6 minutes was growing longer. 3 days later, the Sea of Japan, 12:15 in the afternoon. The ocean surface was a restless field of gray and white. The salvage operation was now a sprawling city of steel. The United States Navy had moved a specialized deep-sea recovery vessel into position. It was flanked by 3 Japanese destroyers and the USS Higgins. 2 miles away, a Russian Tu-95 Bear reconnaissance plane circled at 10,000 feet. It was a constant, low-frequency hum in the sky. Both sides were watching. Both sides were waiting for the first piece of the Zircon to break the surface. In Washington, the official report on the incident was already being circulated among the Joint Chiefs. It was titled The 6-Minute Window. The analysis was blunt. The Russian missile had traveled over 4,000 miles in less than an hour. The final descent into Japanese airspace had taken less than 300 seconds. In that time, the United States government had been forced to decide whether to launch a nuclear retaliatory strike based on the behavior of a single, unpredictable object. The report concluded that the era of strategic warning was over. In the 20th century, a commander had 30 minutes to decide the fate of the world. In the 21st century, that time had been compressed to the length of a commercial break. General Reed stood in his office at the Pentagon. He was looking at a satellite image of the recovery site. He spoke to his deputy. "We are going to find a broken circuit board. We are going to find a cracked heat shield. But we are not going to find the answer to the real problem." The deputy looked up from his tablet. "Which is, the machines are faster than our brains," Reed said. "We have built a world where the speed of war has outpaced the speed of diplomacy. If that missile had hit the fuel farm at Misawa, we would be at war right now. Not because of a political choice, but because our protocols would have demanded it. We would have fired because we didn't have time to think." In Moscow, the fallout was internal. At the NPO Mashinostroyenia Design Bureau, the lead engineers for the Zircon program were being questioned by the State Security Service. The laboratory where the guidance software was written was sealed. Admiral Volkov was not among the investigators. He had been reassigned to a shore command in the far north. His career as a frontline commander was finished. He had been the man on the line when the weapon failed. In the eyes of the Kremlin, he had allowed the Americans to see the weakness of the Russian state. Volkov sat in a small office overlooking the frozen harbor of Murmansk. He was writing his own private assessment. "Modern warfare is no longer a game of chess," he wrote. "It is a game of Russian roulette played at the speed of sound. We have created a weapon that removes the human roulette element from the kill chain. We believe this makes us stronger. In reality, it makes us spectators to our own destruction. The next time a sensor fails, or a line of code breaks, there may not be a Patriot battery in the way to save us from ourselves." 10:15 in time, the morning. 3 days after the event, a robotic submersible reached the sea floor. Its lights cut through the eternal blackness of the deep Pacific. It found a jagged piece of the Zircon's nose cone embedded in the silt. It was cold. It was silent. It was a fragment of a future that the world was not yet ready to inhabit. The recovery ship began to winch the debris toward the surface. The Russian plane overhead banked away, returning to its base. The immediate crisis was a memory. The diplomatic cables had been filed. The broken windows in Misawa were being replaced, but the silence of the ocean was deceptive. The world had survived the 6-minute window, but the window was still there. It was waiting for the next launch, the next failure, the next time the air would turn to fire without warning. Military analysis would later agree on one thing. The victory that day did not belong to the interceptors or the technology. It belonged to the few men and women who chose to wait, who chose to look at the screen and doubt the inevitability of war. In a world of Mach 9, the most powerful weapon is still the human second guess.